Ukraine strikes the Black Sea Fleet once again in Sevastopol, and according to reports, 2 ships, one of them a really modern one that can also launch Caliber cruise missiles, have been sunk. We'll talk about this as well as about the developments along the front line and problems developing on the Ukrainian side in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. Hello and welcome. We have basically daily attacks by the Russians with Shahid and missiles. In the night between the 18th and the 19th, a bigger attack has happened with 37 Shahid. Now and then the numbers are usually smaller, but this was one of the bigger ones. And we have from Kharkiv news here from the Ukrainian side that the Russians used Iskander ballistic missiles to strike the city, and here they are saying that the Russians basically did double tapping. So within a time frame of 30 minutes, they launched a second missile at the same target to strike the 8 personnel that came to aid after the strike. With the aftermath. The result are 5 people dead and 16 people wounded. In this regard, obviously, this would be a war crime if it is true, and the reports are fairly consistent by now that it seems to be a Russian tactic that they now do consistently. Ukraine strikes back against oil infrastructure and against other infrastructure. The attacks continue, and we have some weird video here that you can see. For instance, there we have the Russians shooting down a drone, but as the saying goes, everything that goes up has to go down. And as you can see, the tracer fire, and in the background, that's the city of Novorossiysk. I guess people living there will have received some unwanted presence in this attack. The Ukrainians are also saying that they hit the Kushchiyovskaya, something like this, airfield in Krasnodar. This airfield is used by the Russians for their Sukhoi 25, 27 and Sukhoi 34, as well as the MiG-29. The Ukrainians say that with their drone attack, they damaged several planes. I have not seen any proof of this. I have not seen an admission by the Russians, so it might be true, it might not be true. I do not have any proof. But we do have visual evidence of a fire and explosions in an oil depot here at Viipuri. Here an oil depot caught fire, there were explosions, and the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence, is saying that they are responsible with 4 loads of explosives, that they damaged the oil depot here in this area. So let's switch to the front line. The Russians have now are now confirmed to be in control at the area northeast of Selene, but in the areas north of Liptsi, for instance, I cannot see any fresh advances. Basically, we see what was to be expected over the last few days, that the Russians' advance is slowing down, either because they have achieved their main objectives, which seems unlikely, or simply because they run out of steam because of their heavy losses. That doesn't mean that everything's over. They can still introduce reinforcements, reserves, as the Ukrainians have done to slow them down. But we do have continued advances here further east. In Vovchansk, we have geolocalizations here of a Russian presence in the northeast of the city and in the southwest. And here the Russians have crossed the southern bridge, the southernmost bridge over the river Vovchansk, and they have been struck under the bridge here. So they have not entered, at least not visually, the first houses on this side, but technically they have now crossed the bridge here and are on the other side of Vovchansk. The question about control is unclear. Ukrainian side says they control roughly 60% as of now. Probably 50 to 60% seems to be true. I do not see any significant additional advances by the Russians in the northern front line. Let's switch to the eastern front line, and here the Russians have been successful. Here from Krochmalny, they managed to reach Berestove. They managed to take those tree lines here and advanced roughly 2 kilometers to the southwest in this area here. This should be the Sherebets. I'm not completely sure. No, it's probably not. But they reached Berestove and entered it over the last few days. That was it on the Eastern Front north of the Seversky Donetsk, what I can see. South of the Seversky Donetsk, the Russians are currently claiming that they took Bilohorivka. I have not seen any proof of this, and the Ukrainians deny that, so that might be wrong, as it has been a couple of times in the past, as that the Russians claim successes which have not been proven yet. Maybe they had some small advance and that is blown up out of proportion to capturing the town, but at least as of now I do not see any proof of this. As said, this is word against word and no visual evidence as of now, but it might be true even though there is no proof. Other than that, the Russians advance in the area of Chasiv Yar. Here the attacks, there have been significant attacks by the Russians on Chasiv Yar, up to battalion strength with mechanized forces over the last couple of days, and we do have some visual evidence of their advances. They have reached this house here, and they have reached the house further south, so here and here in the first line. But the thing is, we have the visual evidence because the mechanized units were destroyed at that point, were struck at that point, and the Russians have suffered significant losses as this. So while they have technically entered, and some of the pictures and videos show Russian soldiers disembarking, it does not seem to be the case that this area is under control. As said, it was here and here where the Russians disembarked. So heavy fighting. Russians attack, have partial successes, but unclear whether they actually gain control of it. It seems unlikely regarding their heavy losses, but as said, fighting around Chasiv Yar is continuing. Further south at Avdiivka, the fighting is also continuing. The Russians captured some tree lines here, northeast of Keramik. This is, here is Avdiivka. So at this area, they captured this roughly here. They also advanced at Novoprokhovsk in the area here, west of Semenivka. As said in the past, this was to be expected, as the Ukrainians will slowly withdraw here through the tree lines, where their positions increasingly get vulnerable for them. The mission is to delay the Russians, but that they can hold those tree lines seems to be somewhat unlikely. Further south, they also advanced at Netailove. They have now taken those tree lines here. We've had them in the last situation report already being reported. I think it was here, roughly along this line. So this is now considered to be fully under their control. We have a confirmed advance, and at this point now Netailove is confirmed as having been fallen, as I have visual evidence. Let me just find it. This was still Chasiv Yar. Yeah, we have it here. We have visual evidence of the Russians in the westernmost houses of Netailove. So it seems to be clear that Netailove has now fallen, at least the western part. In the southern part, there might still be Ukrainian presence, but this should be the industrial area and agricultural area. But the town itself seems to be under Russian control as of now. Further south, we have changes close to in the area of Marinka. Now, Krasnohorivka, I cannot confirm any fresh changes, so fighting is continuing there, but it seems like the Russians are stopped, at least for the moment. But here at Novomikhailivka, which has recently fallen, the Russians have now entered Paraskovivka. We have a visual evidence of this as well, which was geolocalized here in the first houses in Paraskovivka. So the Russians have now started house-to-house fighting in this area as well. That was it for the area here south of Velika Novosilka. I cannot confirm any change in territory. And so we go to the area south of Orikhiv here, where one of the two main lines of attacks for the Ukrainians were in the south. The Russians have now full control over the area south here and here, at least according to other observers, and we see them continuing their presence inside of Robotine. As said, for me it's somewhat difficult to judge whether Robotine is fully under their control. If I see them popping up all over town all the time, it feels like they are in control, but obviously we do not have the aftermath. Often we see Russian soldiers being struck and taking casualties, which might be the end of that Russian attack, and after that the Ukrainians might even come back. But what we see is them consistently being attacked further into Robotine, and now they've basically reached the outskirts of Robotine, as we have one geolocalization here. Now we've had them roughly here, 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 and here. So this seems to be that this area here was more or less under Russian control now, and now they have been attacked by the Ukrainians in almost the northernmost houses. So if we look on the map, the Russians are now up to here and more or less up to here. It's a theoretical possibility that those houses are still under Ukrainian control, but we are coming close to a point where we have to say that Robotyne is no longer in Ukrainian hands. It might already be at that moment. As said, the judging where the front line goes is somewhat difficult with the observation just of open source intelligence, as we can only see where they are at that very moment. But it seems like Robotyne has fallen as of now, at least from what I've seen. There is definitely Russian presence all over the town by now. No news from the Dnipro, so we switch over to the Crimean Peninsula, and here the Russians report a new ATACMS attack on Sevastopol. According to Riba, one of the biggest Russian mill bloggers, the Ukrainians used 12 missiles. 9 of them were shot down, but even Riba admits that 3 hit one of the berths in the bay where one of the ships was located. According to reports, it was hit, and the Ukrainians say that they destroyed the Karakurt class Zyklon, which is a modern corvette by the Russians that can launch caliber cruise missiles, and they report that the minesweeper Kovrovets was also sunk. I have not seen visual evidence of either. We have here basically admitting we have here the Russians basically admitting that one of the ships was hit. So I cannot 100% say that those ships were sunk, but it seems to be the case that both at the very least were hit. The news indicate this, even though I want to leave a slight sliver of doubt in the end, but it seems to be 2 additional losses by the Russians of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And we have reactions by the Russians here in Defense Express showing satellite pictures, and those are interesting pictures. This is from Sevastopol, I think. And here we have, no, it's in Novorossiysk. It shows that only the tower of 2 submarines is slightly visible, which means that the Russians filled the ballast tanks of their submarines enough that the majority of the submarine is underwater now. Probably the top exit of the submarine is still accessible without being submerged, but that obviously makes them a much smaller target and more difficult to hit, and thus reduces the risk to them, showing us how the situation is even in Novorossiysk for the Russians, that they feel the need to do something like this. Generally, we have some problematic news from Ukraine, or for the Ukrainian side. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said that Ukraine only has 25% of the air defense that they actually need. He's asking, or almost begging, the West for 2 additional batteries of Patriot systems, and he's saying that Ukraine will need 120 to 130 F-16s to be able to take on the Russians. I think right now it should be roughly 60 that are committed, so only half of what Ukraine needs. And he's saying modern. It can be argued that the F-16 that are being sent are maybe not bad, but probably not the best that is available either. Ukraine needs to build up forces significantly and fast, and they are announcing new brigades all the time, but at the same time he's saying that some of the existing brigades which are empty. So some Ukrainian brigades are basically destroyed. We had that in the past, that the Ukrainian sources themselves said some of the brigades are down to 30% strength. That's no longer combat capable in essence. That's a unit that's good for paper and good for a map, but no longer good for the front line. This is a serious problem that the mobilization might help solve in the future, but everyone being called up now obviously also has to be trained at the same time. And he's saying that Russia is profiting, is having an advantage by the West not allowing the Ukrainians to strike Russia inside of Russia. This is an obvious conclusion. We talked about it here in the past a lot, that there is no legal justification or no legal requirement for the West to restrict the usage of its weapons to Ukrainian soil. By the rules of war, Ukraine is obviously entitled to strike Russian military targets inside of Russia as well, but the West is refusing the usage of them so far. And according to US newspapers, I think it was the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among others, that reported it, Ukraine was asking for a less restrictive rule set for the usage of US delivered weapons. Especially what they asked was permission to strike inside of Russia, and they also asked for help to identify targets inside of Russia to allow the Ukrainians to strike them. So it's not just identification, but obviously it would be data to allow flight path planning and stuff like this. And according to the media reports, the US have refused, as they try to limit the war to Ukraine and are not happy about Ukraine striking Russia at all inside of Russia. And we have more pro-Ukrainian. This is a pro-Ukrainian account here showing us pictures from Sumy, I think. Here, the area is under control of the Ukrainian armed forces for 2 years, and this is where the dragon teeth supposedly are right now. There can always be some claims of justifications 10 kilometers behind the front line, but a lot of the Ukrainian side are complaining wildly that the build-up of fortification has been very botched and very problematic and not done consistently, and those are images seemingly proving this. At the same time, some good news from Ukraine. While they have mostly stopped exporting electricity, they are able to make up, at least to some degree, for their loss of electricity through Russia's strikes on their power plants by importing from Western neighbors. Obviously, this is direly needed for the Ukrainians to keep their defense industry running and to supply their population, and thus keep up morale at the same time. And repairing the electrical grid should be a lot easier than repairing power plants, so it should be somewhat more resilient if the electricity mostly or increasingly comes from the West. And we have good news to a certain degree. So the Russians, I showed you in the last situation report that the Russians had occupied the hospital here, and I showed you the geolocalization and that the Russians had occupied it and the Ukrainians afterwards struck it, and the image analysis says that it was likely aerial bombs that struck it. There's still some debate whether it was JDAM, even though the articles I read claim that it was the ground-launched small diameter bomb that was used here, striking the targets and having a big effect. Obviously, ground-launched small diameter bomb with its range would be much more viable to be used far behind the front line. It has a range of 160 kilometers, but there, according to reports, the GPS jamming made them almost useless. Now, obviously, Ukraine uses them right along the front line, where the Russian GPS jamming has less effect, as obviously the frontline troops won't necessarily bring in GPS jammers. They will be somewhat behind the front line, so the effect is getting stronger the closer it gets to the front line, and then ever stronger after it passes it. Using the ground-launched small diameter bomb along the front line will keep them somewhat accurate and useful. But again, while this is good news, while this shows that Ukraine adapts here and can use the weapons after all, it's unfortunately probably not where ground-launched small diameter bomb would have made the biggest effect, namely by striking Russian targets over 150 kilometers behind the front line with big bomb loads, with high accuracy, allowing them to destroy command centers and ammunition dumps, bridges, etc. And Ukrainians are reporting that Russia is currently redeploying forces towards Sumy. Up here, we had Budanov a couple of days ago saying that in a few days he expects a second Russian invasion here into Sumy. So this would be a sign of it probably coming fairly soon. According to different analysis, the Russians are not really trying to take Kharkiv. Their troops aren't strong enough. They will likely just want to cross the border, bring Kharkiv into tube artillery range and build a buffer zone. This would require them to attack here as well. So maybe we'll see this in the coming days, but this buffer zone then could extend into the area of Sumy here as well, as they do not have the ambition to strike deep into Ukraine as of now, and as directly at the front line, directly at the border, the fortifications are very light. As due to the Russian threat of artillery and drones, the Ukrainians weren't able to build them up. And in troop generation terms, in some regard, we have something from Russian mill bloggers, Dva Mayors. The two majors, for instance, published a letter from the Russian Ministry of Defense about the artillery shells. And according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, it's the problems with artillery are with bad handling of basically the artillery men are incompetent, and they say you shouldn't weigh the shells because in the past the Russian soldiers were continuously complaining about the low quality of Russian artillery shells and inconsistent filling of the propellants and of the shells itself. Obviously a shell that has, let's say, 10% less weight will have a different ballistic arc than one with the standard weight, and if the load of each shell is varying massively, then the accuracy will suffer highly under it. So Russians started to weigh the shells to find out where the problem is. One of the claims are that those are mostly shells from North Korea, but it could be a sign of a decrease in quality in the Russian defense industry too. Obviously then a victim of increased production, cutting corners to increase production. Anyways, so it seems to be a clear issue with the Russian artillery shells, which will be a sign of their decreased accuracy. That is some good news for Ukraine, as obviously the Russians will, for the time being, have more artillery shells to fire, but less accuracy means they are somewhat useless, at least if the Ukrainians are in cover, as a shell that hits 100 meters away while you are in cover is basically useless. The Russians could have as well not shot it at all for the Ukrainians. So the discrepancy in artillery volume, excuse me, I don't know why my English is failing me right now. The discrepancy in artillery volume will be less distinct if this is a consistent problem on the Russian side. And from the Ukrainian side, we have some good news too, adaptations. The Ukrainians have adapted an OSA surface-to-air missile system, NATO code SA-8. This is the SA-8 Gecko. It's a short-range air defense system of which Ukraine has a fair number, and they clearly ran out of ammo, so they did some Frankensem here as well, and this picture shows them using R-73 air-to-air missiles from those systems. OSA is usually using SACLOS, so basically optical guidance for their missiles. The R-73 are infrared though. This means that the radar system is likely only being used to identify the target, then the infrared seeker of the air-to-air missile will lock on, and then it's being launched. OSA usually has a maximum range of 10 kilometers and 6 kilometers in altitude. This has to be understood as maximum under ideal circumstances. Effectively is usually somewhat lower, and the R-73, depending on versions that the Ukrainians use, has a maximum distance of engagement for 20 to 30 kilometers. But here the important thing is this is while in the air. So while the plane gives it potential energy, while the air density is lower and thus friction is lower, all of this will then massively reduce the range of the R-73 while being ground launched from zero velocity. So in the end, the range will probably be close to what the OSA originally had, maybe marginally longer, but we should not just look on Wikipedia and see that it's 30 kilometers. So now OSA will be able to fight 30 kilometers. That would be a massive mistake here. But still, we see Ukrainian adaptation, and depending on the warhead, obviously at the very least they will be useful to strike cruise missiles to shoot them down if they can find enough R-73, and it seems they still have enough of them. And from the British Ministry of Defense, we have the news that Russia, according to estimates, is lacking 4.8 million in the workforce, for 4.8 million men in the workforce. 25% of all jobs among lorry drivers, among truck drivers, cannot be filled up. This is obviously impacting logistics, as you can imagine. And the reasons for that are mobilization, people fleeing the country, and additional restrictions for migration after the Crocus terrorist attack. All of this is causing problems as Russia is basically running out of men. This is good news too for Ukraine, as it shows that while Russia might have the bigger population, it will not be able to simply turn every man in the country into a soldier, as a lot of civilian jobs will still be needed, and there Russia is increasingly getting problems. And we have good news from France for Ukraine. Here Jean-Louis Bourlange says he's the spokesperson, the speaker for the foreign what is it called? The Foreign Council, I think, in the parliament. And he demands that France releases French weapons for usage inside of Russia, as he says it's absurd they're not. Now, some news outlets reported, some channels reported that France is giving permission. I have not found that yet. I just found that the council, the committee, that was the word, the Foreign Committee of the parliament is demanding it from the government. But so far, I have not found that the government gave permission already. But as we've seen that François Macron, or is it François? I don't know. Macron, the French president, that he is increasingly getting more self-confident towards Russia. It seems a possibility that this will soon have an effect and Ukraine will at least be able to use French weapons on Russian soil. That was it from me for now. If you enjoyed this situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what you think about the current situation and the hesitancy of Western nations to allow Ukraine to strike Russian targets inside of Russia, thus giving Russia a sanctuary from which it can operate with only limited threat. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and this channel maybe at some point even reaches 100,000. This would be my goal for this year. If you want to support the channel, this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel, and that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.